info. She is talking about ghosts hanging around what some say is a real-life haunted house in Metro Detroit.
Haunted houses pop up all over the place this time of year.
A new Wall Street Journal report profiles the many parents who think they can see ghosts, specters, and mysterious movements on their advanced baby monitors.
Baby crib.
I freaked out. I stopped what I was doing and I ran upstairs and I grabbed my daughter.
Heather says this so-called ghost scratched her daughter Lily and attacked her too.
You are tuned in to the Ghost Signal. Hello and good morning or evening wherever you are across the 24 time zones, and welcome to the Ghost Signal. My name is Jeff and I will be your control operator, your sultan of spooky, your guide through mystery houses and axe murder houses. This is episode 11, The Life of Riley, where we examine the story of a man who was hired to guard the Skinwalker Ranch years ago and the strange occurrences he witnessed. This is also going to be the first episode where there will be no other segments, no graveyard shift or witching hour, just one great big slab of spooky stuff. A few announcements before we begin. If you have a true ghost story for the graveyard shift segment or a twisted tale of terror for the Light in the Attic Patreon segment, please send it to theghostsignalpodcast@gmail.com or visit theghostsignalpodcast.com and submit them there. If I read it on the show and you include a mailing address with your submission, I will send you a Ghost Signal sticker, a 3 a.m. sticker, voodoo dolls, shrunken heads, Lizzie Borden's axe, and an English translation of the Necronomicon. Some of that was true. The Ghost Signal Patreon is live, so if you wish to contribute to the show in that way you can. There is a $1 tier called the Spirit tier, where you can listen to episodes ad-free on the same day as the regular episode releases. And there is a $5 tier called the Spectre tier, in which you also gain access to ad-free versions of the episodes, but also a Light in the Attic, where I narrate creepypastas from all across the internet, and a short video where you can take a peek behind the curtain of the Ghost Signal. Are you a spirit or a specter? Go to www.patreon.com/the Ghost Signal Podcast and choose the tier that's right for you. There is also a Discord server for the Ghost Signal. Discord is free to join, so feel free to jump in anytime to say hi and interact with other listeners who share a taste for the paranormal. Go to theghostsignalpodcast.com and scroll down until you see the link. Click on the link, then click on the Join Server button, then click on the Join Now button and you're in. So download the Discord app, create your free account, and come hang out with us on the Ghost Signal Podcast server today. There are places in the world where conventional wisdom fails, where scientific testing produces more questions than answers. There are places where mankind was not meant to tread, but we do anyway. This is one man's testimony of what he experienced at one such location. Prepare for dead air.
Dead air.
The notorious Skinwalker Ranch, previously known as the Sherman Ranch, sits on 512 acres of land just to the southeast of Roosevelt, Utah in the Uintah Basin. It was first owned by Ken and Edith Myers from 1934 to 1994. It was then purchased by Terry and Gwen Sherman, who only had the ranch until 1996. It was then bought by multi-millionaire Robert Bigelow, founder and president of Bigelow Aerospace. He sold the property to Brandon Fugel via Adamantium Holdings in 2016 for an undisclosed sum of money. Stories and legends of strange activity have persisted here for many years, including cattle that vanish and reappear mutilated with surgical precision, UFO sightings, large bipedal animals that are unaffected by bullets, invisible objects emitting dangerous magnetic fields, and poltergeist activity. One legend states that the land was cursed by the Navajo tribe during the U.S.'s westward expansion as an act of retribution against the Ute tribe, who were friendly and cooperative with the white federal soldiers. The Navajo saw the Utes as traitors and cursed their land as punishment for their transgressions. Others seem to think that the ranch is the crash site of an alien spacecraft, and its supposed magnetic propulsion system is wreaking havoc across the region. Whatever the actual story is, there's no doubt strange phenomena has been witnessed and documented by many people, several of whom are scientists and researchers throughout the years. Now to discuss how the ranch earned its peculiar moniker. What is a skinwalker exactly? In Navajo culture, a skinwalker is a type of evil witch or shaman who has the ability to possess or shapeshift into an animal, most commonly coyotes. The Navajo people are reluctant to discuss these traditional beliefs with outsiders, as they fear the curse can come back on them if they do. They also fear cultural appropriation, which is a very legitimate concern. The following story is that of a man known only as Riley, a pseudonym for a man that understandably wants to keep his identity a secret, not only for his safety but for the safety of his family and friends. He was a property guard at Skinwalker Ranch for a short time, and the tale he tells, dear listeners, is equally fantastic and terrifying. Riley was hired in 2009 by the company that owned the ranch at the time, which stands to reason that company was Bigelow Aerospace. After he served in the military for over 20 years as an MP, and having seen the world, he was ready to live the life of a civilian. He had a job selling cell phones that was, in his words, less than fulfilling. His marriage had failed, he was living with his parents in Las Vegas, and was having a little trouble finding his footing. He had friends who had also retired from the military, who suggested he apply for a job working security. One of them told him about a place out in Utah that was truly bizarre, and that piqued his curiosity a bit, so he went for it, and it wasn't long at all before an interview was set up. The interview itself was odd. There were two men in a house that was being converted into office space. One was a man with an Irish accent who Riley suggests may have been Robert Bigelow himself. The other was most likely an ex-federal guy, maybe FBI or CIA. From Riley's description, I can't help but picture Fox Mulder. They asked questions pertaining not to just his experience in the military, but to his beliefs in UFOs and the paranormal. Riley knew from what he had been told that the owner was into that stuff big time, and he was growing more curious by the minute, so he told them what they wanted to hear. A few days later, he got the phone call that the job was his. He went into their office to fill out paperwork, sign the non-disclosure agreement, and get briefed on what he would be doing. For the first 3 months, he would patrol the owner's properties in Vegas, just to get familiar with the culture. Then he would be shipped off to the ranch for 2 weeks, then brought back home. When the time came to travel to Utah, he was a bit apprehensive. He had heard stories from other guards who had cycled in and out of the ranch a few times, and they were something else. He couldn't decide if they were for real or just messing with the new guy. But the seeds of doubt were planted nonetheless. The flight was from McCarran to Vernal, Utah, about 550 miles. There are always to be 2 guards on the property at all times, and on Riley's first rotation, his partner would be Mark, a guy he had met once or twice in Vegas but wasn't too familiar with. Mark picked him up from the airport along with a woman who appeared to be in her 60s. She introduced herself as Joan. She and her husband Jack were the ranch caretakers. After stopping to pick up some supplies and groceries, they set out for the ranch. They entered through the east gate and proceeded to the ranch house where Joan and her husband lived, just a few hundred feet away from the main entrance. The trailer where Mark and Riley were to live in for the next couple weeks was right behind the ranch house. Riley doesn't give any particulars about what time of year this happened, but he says that it was in the teens that first day, so it must have been during the winter months. Mark then took Riley on a tour of the ranch, to Skinwalker Ridge and the mesa where the most UFO activity has been seen. Mark explained that the boss wants them, on top of their duties keeping trespassers out, was documenting the strange occurrences that they would inevitably experience. Mark then took him over to the old homestead, where he told Riley he has seen strange creatures going in and out of. The whole area gave Riley an acute sense of the spooky and suggested that they head back to the trailer. As it was getting late and the sun was hanging low in the sky, Mark agreed. Later that night was their first patrol. They both went up on the mesa to get a good look of the ranch. Mark then asked Riley to take some pictures of him with his camera, making sure that Mark was dead center in the frame. So after taking a few pictures, they descended from the mesa to check on the east gate, then on to the rest of the ranch with nothing out of the ordinary happening. When they got back to the trailer for some rest, Mark examined the pictures Riley had taken at the top of the mesa. In a few of the pictures were some bluish orbs floating about. Riley didn't seem that interested, but Mark had to report the pictures to home base in the morning, and now so did Riley. He was already beginning to feel less like a security guard and more like a ghost hunter. The next day was uneventful. Their patrols around the ranch during the day seemed like they were to be done for consistency's sake, rather than out of necessity. That night, however, was to be much different. They both set out at exactly 10 p.m. and began their rounds as usual, but as they got to the southern border of the property, Mark noticed something unusual in the snow by the gulch that runs through the area. Tracks, but of what Riley couldn't say. They were shaped like undersized bowling pins with a stride of about 4 feet and seemed to be leading away from the gulch. When he asked what on earth could have made those tracks, Mark simply replied that they don't call it Skinwalker Ranch for nothing. Riley couldn't believe what he was hearing. These were Skinwalker tracks? Riley wanted to know what they looked like, so Mark described them. According to Mark, they looked like a cross between a coyote with mange and a person dying of starvation, distended belly and all, and smelled like a raccoon carcass that had been cooking in the desert heat for 3 days. Later that night, on another patrol, Mark and Riley split up. Mark took the east gate and Riley the mesa. After climbing to the top, he stopped to catch his breath in the cold winter air. Only a few minutes had gone by when he heard drumming. Not drums from someone's car stereo, but a simpler beat. He listened closer and recognized the rhythm. It was Native American tom-toms, and they weren't far off. He began to hunt down the source of the drumming, but as soon as he got close, they stopped. Confused, Riley began to try and track down who or what had been up there with him. He then heard it again, except this time the sound was coming from where he had originally climbed the mesa. Now he was getting spooked. He radioed Mark, asking him to join him on the mesa to see if he could hear the drums as well. But by the time Mark made it to Riley's position, they had stopped altogether. He believed Riley anyway. His exact words were, "Crap like this happens all the time." The weather began to turn, so they decided to head in for the night. Mark told him to make sure to put the drums in his patrol report with as much detail as he could, that the home office loves that kind of stuff. Riley has a recurring dream. It's been happening since his childhood, and there's no rhyme or reason to its timing. It's very sporadic. Months, sometimes years go by before it happens. In it, a featureless figure stands at the foot of his bed while he sleeps, and just watches him. It's not particularly scary, but it is unsettling, and he's never been able to put a name to it as it has no facial features or any other identifying characteristics. But while he was on the ranch, it was happening not only every single night, but with a frightening new intensity. He was not getting any real sleep and it was wearing him down. When he told Mark about it, he suggested that Riley put a video camera on a tripod and put it in the corner of his room to record him while he slept, with the idea that maybe he would capture footage of something. Riley agreed, and that night he set up the camera in his room. He fell asleep around 3:15 a.m. Not long after, he woke up, laying on his back and looking at the figure at the foot of his bed. Only this time it had a face, the face of pure evil. Riley woke from his dream in a rage, trying to punch and kick at his nightmare visitor. When he came to his senses, He just sat there in his bed, trying with all of his resolve to calm down. He then looked at the clock on his nightstand, 4:21 a.m. He had only been asleep for an hour, so he climbed back into bed and slept until the morning. The camera was still recording. Riley made bacon for breakfast the next morning, which brought Mark out of his slumber. Riley told him about his bad dream a few hours prior, which made Mark very curious about what the camera had captured. So while Riley jumped in the shower, he grabbed the camera from his room and hooked it up to his laptop. When Riley emerged from the bathroom, Mark insisted that he come look at the footage. He was visibly excited and low-key terrified. The footage showed that at around 4 a.m., 8 to 10 red orbs, giving off their own reflections and quite obviously existing in 3D space, danced around the foot of Riley's bed. After a few minutes, they disappeared, and in their place was the silhouette of a human, amorphous and darker than the darkness of night. Then, without warning, Riley's covers were ripped off of him. The shadow figure disappeared, and the red orbs returned, only to dance out of frame as Riley sits up and starts to throw punches in his sleep. Both men were stunned. Did they really just see that? They looked at each other and without saying a word walked into Riley's room to look for evidence. Nothing seemed out of place until Mark noticed something on the window. A handprint, but on the outside of the glass. That's when they noticed the tracks. The same bowling pin-shaped tracks they saw earlier in the gulch. But even more concerning was that there was only one set going away from the trailer, like whatever had made them had been in the trailer the whole time. Riley's first 2-week rotation was in the books. He caught an early flight home that Sunday morning and got a taxi to take him to his parents' 2-story ranch with a separate apartment on top. The next day he went into town to run a few errands and to do some shopping. While he was out, he felt a bit thirsty, so he stopped into the bar he and his father were regulars at. He pulled up his customary stool, and Ringo the bartender immediately materialized a frosted mug of lager and placed it in front of him. Riley hadn't even taken a sip when a stranger pulled up the stool next to him. He was a Native American man with a long black ponytail and wore a thin faded flannel jacket, which Riley found odd as it was only 40 degrees outside that day. Ringo asked him what he wanted, to which he replied old number 7. Again, odd. Who calls Jack Daniel's whiskey that? The stranger paid Ringo with cash. He didn't even get to the register when he stopped in his tracks. Ringo asked him if he really wanted to pay with what he was given, which was an old silver certificate from the Old West. The stranger asked, "Oh, that's not enough?" He then proceeded to pull a roll of them out of his pocket and started counting them. He had at least 50 of those old certificates. Ringo said that the one was fine and put the bill under the register like you would do with 50s or 100s. Riley looked on eBay to see what one of those would go for on the collector's market. To his surprise, depending on the condition, just one of those silver certificates could go for $2,000 to $3,000. Riley put on his poker face and continued to sip his beer. He began to notice a peculiar smell coming from the stranger, like wet dog or worse. As what happens sometimes when you're sitting next to a stranger in a bar, a conversation started up. The man introduced himself as Curtis Sammer, and after some small talk, made a proposition for Riley that would be mutually beneficial. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out an old silver coin, asking how much Riley thought it was worth. Taking it in his hands, he could see from the tarnish that it was 100% silver. The writing was in Spanish, with the name Carlos III on it, and it was dated 1804. Riley wasn't into coin collecting and guessed at $15 or $20. Curtis told him that he knows where there's many more of these, some of which were made of gold instead of silver. When Riley asked him where, Curtis said caves under a ridge on a ranch in Utah, in the Uintah Valley, and that the place was heavily guarded. He had just described Skinwalker Ridge. But Riley put on his best poker face, saying he'd never heard of it. Curtis didn't believe him and told him that he would be there in about 2 weeks after taking care of some things. Riley then excused himself to the bathroom, needing to collect his thoughts for a moment. When he came back, Curtis was gone, and nobody saw him leave. When Riley got out to his car, he noticed his watch had stopped at the exact moment Curtis showed up. A few days passed without incident. After he worked a shift patrolling one of the buildings the owner had in Las Vegas, Riley went home to have an Italian dinner with his parents. Afterwards, he retired to his apartment to watch some TV before heading out to sleep. He was out before his head hit the pillow. All in all, a very mundane, basic day. So far. Not too long after he fell asleep, he awoke in terror, the intense feeling of someone or something watching him. Whatever it was gave off an overwhelming aura of menace and hate. He laid in bed as still and as quietly as he possibly could, while weighing his options. One idea was just to wait it out until whoever it was went away. This idea was quickly abandoned. The feeling grew in intensity, and he could hear its breathing now. The other option was to go for his 9mm in his nightstand, which unfortunately was to his back. He would have to roll over as fast as he could and get his handgun before whoever or whatever was in there with him bolted either through the bedroom door or out the window. Remembering that burglars tend to be non-confrontational and that they just want to sneak in, grab your most expensive stuff and leave, he decided to go for the 9mm. In one fluid motion, he spun around in his bed, ripped the drawer of his nightstand open and grabbed his handgun, swinging it around to aim at the intruder and taking the safety off at the same time. Military police training had served him well. He commanded his unwanted guests to get out or risk getting their brains blown out. Nothing. No footsteps running away, no breakables hitting the floor as someone sprinted for the front door. Nothing. All was quiet. Adrenaline still pumping through him, he cautiously sauntered over to the light switch across the room and flipped it on. Just as the lights came on, at the far end of the hallway outside his bedroom, he saw a shadow figure step backwards onto the staircase that led down into the kitchen. It happened so fast he could hardly believe his own eyes. He immediately went down to investigate the kitchen, but again, nothing was amiss. All doors were securely locked. Rattled, confused, and exhausted, he went back upstairs to try and get some sleep. After this event, the shadow figure showed up in the hallway just outside his bedroom door every night. What was happening on the ranch was now happening at his parents' house, and Riley was feeling the strain. After returning to the ranch about a week later, Mark and Riley were reviewing some video footage they had captured the night before. A dark-colored SUV had come up to the south gate where one person had gotten out of the back seat, walked up to the gate, took a few pictures with their cell phone, and bounced out of there. While not technically trespassing, they still needed to file a report. It was at this moment that Joan, the caretaker's wife, knocked on the door. She informed the two men that earlier that morning she had spotted coyote tracks around their cabin. Joan estimated that there were approximately 5 or 6 of them, and that they had come right up to both the front door and the back door. Coyotes were not uncommon on the ranch, but for them to have the hubris that these animals had was unsettling. So Joan asked them if they could track down the coyotes and find out how exactly they were getting on the property when the entire perimeter was lined with a huge barbed wire fence. They only took their 9mm handguns with them for protection, not extermination. Mark and Riley were joined by Jack the caretaker. When they examined the tracks by the cabin, they noticed that the ones closest to the doors were substantially larger than the rest, suggesting that they were made by an alpha pair and that the smaller tracks were made by juveniles. The tracks were easy to follow in the freshly fallen snow. Jack decided to stay behind after informing Mark and Riley that the cold was playing hell with his back. The trail twisted and turned all throughout the ranch until finally coming to a stop at the remains of Homestead 2. Mark suggested that they start making loud noises to scare them out, but nothing emerged. They both knew they'd have to go inside. So, in they went, careful not to step on any patches of rotted wood or trip on any debris. They had guns drawn and flashlights out, looking like a pair of FBI agents on a clandestine mission. After several minutes of searching, they turned up nothing except paw prints that stopped abruptly in a back closet, like the coyotes had gone in there and had gotten beamed up. Riley stood there dumbfounded, and while he was trying to wrap his brain around what he was looking at, Mark was taking pictures, saying how much they were going to love this back at the home office. It was almost as if Mark had expected this to happen. They were on their way back to the trailer when Mark shared his theory about what had happened to the coyotes. He told Riley that about half a dozen times before, while he was patrolling by Homestead 2, he had seen what he called liquid light. Sort of like ethereal glowing green and purple candle wax in midair. It only lasts for a few seconds, then disappears, and every time Mark sees it, it gives him chills up and down his spine, like what he's looking at is not from this reality. Upon returning, they made themselves some warm food and coffee and typed up their reports. After which Riley went to his room for a nap, as it was becoming customary since he was having such a hard time sleeping through the night. He fell into a dream, the kind of dream that meanders in and out of memories and fantasies, weaving unhinged narratives that are best left untold. Except at the end of this one, he was staring at the shadow person, and was certain of his own demise. It was then Mark shook him awake. Riley came out of his dream with a fury, throwing punches into empty spaces again. Mark, caught off guard, stepped back and accidentally tripped on Riley's boots, hitting the ground with a dull thud. Riley snapped at Mark, asking what in the hell he thought he was doing, waking him up from a deep sleep that he so desperately needed. Mark told him that he saw something go into Riley's room, something that looked exactly like what they had seen on the video camera footage a few weeks prior, walk right through his closed bedroom door. Mark, concerned for Riley's safety, went up to his door and placed an ear on it, listening for any kind of disturbance. Even though all was quiet, he decided to check on Riley just in case. As soon as the light from the hallway reached the foot of Riley's bed, Mark saw something shadow-like dart into one of the corners and disappear. He went over to check on Riley, who was still sleeping, but his eyes were wide open. That's when Mark decided to wake him up. At this point in the story, both men noticed the unmistakable odor of wet dog fur. The next several days were uneventful. Mark and Riley had gotten back into their old routine, and in fact had gotten somewhat complacent. It was now the dead of winter, and the frequency of trespassers was at an all-time low, especially during the day. They had even began splitting up the patrols, going out alone from time to time. They had let their guard down. This particular night presented itself with clear skies, little to no wind, and a crisp winter's chill. If Riley had known this was going to be his final night on the ranch, he might have taken the time to soak it in a little more. Mark drove Riley to the mesa where he would start his rounds for that shift. After finding nothing up there but a coyote chirping and nosing through rocks and underbrush for rodents to snack on, he came back down. But as he did, he lost his footing and slid most of the way, losing his flashlight and cell phone along the way. All he had was his walkie-talkie, so he let Mark know what had just happened. Mark informed him that he was dealing with some travelers that had gotten turned around and was helping them find their way back to the highway and would pick him up at Homestead 2 just as soon as he was done. Riley confirmed the plan and started the journey. While he was walking, he noticed something odd. There was no sound. All of the animals had fallen silent, like they do when there's an apex predator nearby. No crickets, owls, coyotes howling, nothing. As he was nearing Homestead 2, he saw the purple and green lights reflecting off of the tree trunks that stood beside the building. He stopped dead in his tracks, calling Mark on his radio, but even that had failed him. He was all alone. The lights had disappeared just as quickly as they had materialized, so Riley decided to continue on to the old homestead. He only got a few feet when two golden yellow orbs appeared from behind the back of the building and danced around in the trees. Riley was completely frozen with fright. Was he looking at aliens or ghosts or what? They looked like glowing balloons being pulled by invisible strings. He glanced down at his radio, praying to whatever god is up there that it would somehow come back to life, and when he looked back up, they too had evaporated into the cold night air. What the hell was happening? Is someone playing a really bad prank on him? He went up to the doorway of the old homestead to investigate, more intrigued than scared, but he saw nothing. He decided to go around to the back, maybe that would yield some answers. The only thing that greeted him back there was an overwhelming stench of wet dog. From out behind two of the trees up the trail from the homestead came two skinwalkers. He had only the moon and stars to illuminate them, but from what he could see, Mark had described them almost perfectly. They stood nearly 6 feet tall and had the hind legs of a dog, but were standing upright. Their arms and legs were bony. The body hair or fur was patchy with skin that looked like it had mange, and their faces were half human and half canine, with a short muzzle, pointed ears, and jagged yellow teeth. Riley was looking eye to eye with two nightmares made flesh, and they were coming for him. He took out his 9mm and fired into the air, hoping to just scare them away, but instead they seemed to grow more agitated. There was no turning back now. He would have to stand his ground and defend himself. They began to circle around him, hunting as pack hunters do. Riley wasn't having any of it, so he opened fire at the one closest to him, which couldn't have been more than 20 feet away. He landed 2 direct hits that did nothing. Panic set in. Oh God, now what? Out of sheer desperation, he shot at the other one. Bullets had no effect on that one either. With the fight option exhausted, all he had left was flight, so he darted into the old homestead for cover, not sure of what his next move should be. This shadow person was waiting for him and attacked. Riley couldn't breathe. It was as if all of the air had gotten sucked out of his lungs. His pistol hit the floor and fell into the rotten basement below. Dizziness and nausea set in, and all he felt after that was falling, and everything went black. When he came to, he was in a place completely unfamiliar to him. There was no direct light. It was as if everything was lit up by amber lights coming from within the walls, which were cool and smooth like they had been chiseled and tooled. He wandered around in this hellscape for hours, maybe days, trying to find his way out and back onto the ranch. He eventually found stairs that went down and back up again, thousands of them, trailing off into some unknown purgatory from which he could not escape. He felt neither fatigue nor hunger in this place. He continued on relentlessly, desperately wishing he still had his weapon. Without it, he felt helpless in this nightmare. Along the way, he saw crude etchings in the walls depicting a human figure with a dog's head. He felt like he was on another planet in another universe. Hours and hours went by, hope fading that he would ever find his way home. Eventually, he saw a human-like shadow moving across a cave opening in the distance. He tried calling out to it, but his voice didn't come from his own mouth. Instead, it seemed to emanate from somewhere in the distance, barely recognizable as his. He went in for a closer look, and what he saw was unbelievably strange. 6 or 7 little people, as he calls them, about 3 feet tall, were dancing around a fire to the beat of the drums he had heard on the mesa a few weeks ago. It was like some kind of ceremony, and it never ended. Riley just sat inside the cave entrance for hours, waiting for something different to happen. He hadn't noticed the altar behind the little people. On it was a body, roughly the same size as him, covered in a shroud. Suddenly, without warning, one of the little people threw some kind of powder onto the fire, flourishing its arms in some kind of ritualistic way. The fire exploded in a flash of white light, and the body on the altar sat up, revealing its face. It was Riley's, and it began to scream in absolute terror. Riley instantly felt nauseous again, gripping his midsection and wincing against the pain. When he opened his eyes again, he was in a hospital bed with someone's hands holding him down. He realized those hands belonged to a nurse, and he had done his act where he comes out of his sleep punching and kicking, except this time he had ripped out an IV out of his arm. He asked the nurse how he got there, to which he replied that he had arrived by ambulance just a short time before. The IV bag was about 80% full, so he knew she was telling the truth. The nurse also told him that 2 men had come in to check on him and would be back in a few hours. Riley, dehydrated and exhausted, passed out until the 2 men returned. As it turned out, one of these men was Mark. The other man was a man named Paul, who was one of the main men from the home office. Mark held a McDonald's bag in his hands, and Riley had never been so happy to see him, and scarfed down the contents of the bag in world record time. He gave Riley the condensed version of what had happened. He had disappeared from Homestead 2 for roughly 80 hours. Mark, Joan, Jack, and the local police turned the entire ranch upside down over and over again to no avail. They were beginning to worry that if Riley was still alive, that he would die of exposure before anyone found him. After all, it was the dead of winter, and it never got above 20 degrees the whole time he was missing. It was during sweep number 5 of the old homestead that Riley was found, in the same exact spot he had disappeared from. He was unresponsive and gaunt, like he hadn't slept or eaten the entire time he was gone. Nobody could quite explain how he got there, as that house had been searched thoroughly 4 times already, or how his core temperature was still within normal range after being in the bitter cold for 3 days. After he was well enough to travel, he was flown back to Las Vegas and quit working security for Bigelow Aerospace shortly after. He was done with the ranch, but the ranch was not done with him. Phenomena kept occurring in his parents' house. Poltergeist activity, horrible nightmares, the wet dog smell, all of it only increased. He didn't know what to do, so after some work with Professor Google, came across an old Native American legend that if you accept money from an evil spirit, you would be cursed by it. Remembering his old Spanish silver coin, he decided to make contact with a medicine man to remove the curse. It took some doing, but he managed to set up a meeting with a man named Aaron Manchester, a full-blooded Paiute medicine man. He explained to Riley that the man who gave him the old silver coin, Curtis Sammers, was most likely the shadow person who had been tormenting Riley and his family for months, and agreed to come to their house and cleanse it. He even took the old coin from Riley, removing the curse altogether. Riley's life had returned to normal, or as normal as it could after his nightmarish ordeal. Riley has since relocated to Peru, to a small community of ex-military folks, to seek answers from shamans and mystics, trying to put his mind at ease. He is still trying. Today, Brandon Fugel owns the ranch and is carrying out investigations and experiments much like Robert Bigelow did years ago, except this time you can watch them being carried out by an astrophysicist named Travis Taylor on a show called The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch on the History Channel. It seems that every answer they get, 2 more questions pop up in its place. We may never know what is actually happening on the ranch, what unknown forces of nature are at play in that secluded piece of Utah scrubland. Maybe it's better that way. You know, I'm usually pretty down for camping and spending some time outside, but I'm sorry, especially if you're in Utah, I'm never going anywhere near your state. And with that, episode 11 is complete. If you've made it this far, you have my heartfelt gratitude. I cannot thank you enough for choosing to listen to the Ghost Signal when there's so many others out there. Would you like to share your story? If you would, please visit theghostsignalpodcast.com and follow the link to email me, and I will put it in a future episode. If you would like to be one of us, visit www.patreon.com/theghostsignalpodcast to gain access to exclusive content. Join the Ghost Signal Discord server and hang out with other listeners from all across the globe. The Ghost Signal is executively produced by Jason Wilson, custom sound beds by J.M. Scherf, video editing wizardry by Hale, creative direction by Cassie, and Patreon mastery by Brooks Bigley. And my name is Jeff, your friendly control operator and your ghost host with the most. The next time the Ghost Signal haunts your eardrums, we travel to Oklahoma and visit the Back family who has lived in an old Victorian mansion for over 25 years. That mansion is known as the McBride House. Ending transmission. Reach me at theghostsignalpodcast@gmail.com.
This has been a Grey Rooms production. Copyright 2021 and 2022.
The ghost signal is lost. Transmission terminated.